This is Create the Next from ProCFO Partners, where every week we explore strategies and ideas for financial management and growth to help today's businesses put their financial picture in context.
Welcome back to Create the Next from ProCFO Partners. I am Chris Bintliff, and I'm joined again by Raji Kalra. Raji is our not-for-profit expert, knower of all things, wisdom holder, and it's great to have you back, Raji. Thanks for joining us. And I thought today, it's still so topical for even businesses, small businesses. It would be interesting to talk a little bit about the importance of scenario planning. We've got a great idea, and here's how we're going to map that out, versus contingency planning. Wait, things didn't go how we thought they would go, and here's what we do. But that's my interpretation. Help me break it down. Let's start there. What do you mean when we talk about scenario planning versus contingency planning?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, you got it right. So scenario planning, good guess. Scenario planning is exactly what it sounds like. You don't know what's coming up in the future, and as you're budgeting for the next year, you're really trying to say, okay, well, what if this happens? Maybe your revenue and operations are tied to a potential election, or some sort of policy shift or change, or some sort of government funding that may or may not be going away. Especially in these times, there's a lot of uncertainty. So you scenario plan, because as market shift and the economy shifts, if there's a downturn, there's normally a lag between nonprofit and for-profit sectors. So donors will continue to will continue to give money until they start maybe losing some of their investments or not doing as well. And so what we see in the nonprofit sector is typically after a market crash, the funding won't go away for about 8 to 12 months. There's a lag. So knowing that there's this sort of delay in loss of funding, we encourage nonprofits to do scenario planning for that next future year, to say, well, okay, knowing that there might be a dip and we might lose some donors, might gain others, because this pandemic has definitely had some winners and some losers. And a lot of nonprofits are seeing new funding streams that they wouldn't expect possible before. But others have really suffered. And so what does it look like if we lose 20% of our revenue? What do we need to, and what's realistic? You know, I sit on a bunch of boards of nonprofits, and I walked them through, said, let's come up with 2 to 3 scenarios of our best case and our worst case, and somewhere in the middle. And let's see what we feel comfortable with. And so a lot of them used the worst case, just because they were like, well, we want to be super conservative, and let's try to operate and scale back. And what does that look like if we lost 40, 50% of our funding? What would that do to our programming? What does that do to our staff? And many nonprofits, they're mostly personnel in terms of expenses, depending on how you operate. So how do we continue to operate without losing staff? Do we furlough? A lot of them did salary freezes and hiring freezes so that they could maintain their current staff and not have extra unemployment out in the world. So that's sort of scenario planning, where you come up with a couple of scenarios to say, maybe we'll get a new donor and it'll be our best case scenario. But a lot of folks try to plan for that really conservative worst case, just to see what that would look like for operations. Contingency planning is a little different. It's more of, when things are just normal. Like I would say, you're doing a budget for next year and you want to figure out, well, we have a couple of, if we got this funding, I would hire X, Y, and Z people. We would travel more. We would do a staff retreat. There's all these other things on our wish list that we would love to do. And let's put that in there as like, well, if we got this funding, we would do X, Y, and Z. Now, if we didn't get another funding that we were expecting and we budgeted for, where do we cut? What are the dates and timelines that we need to make those decisions by? So you prioritize what you currently have in your budget that you're hoping that you will actually be able to action out. And then sort of prioritize those and say, maybe we can delay a couple of the positions that we were planning on hiring. Maybe we don't do this event that we were planning. If by, say, November, we don't get that funding, come February, we don't do that program or project. So it's more like throughout the year, you're checking in to make sure that you are hitting your targets and that you're able to continue down that list of priorities that you are hoping to sort of institute and run.
Is that like a quarterly check-in or a monthly check-in, or how often? I suppose it depends on the organization.
It depends. I would say you should do that at least on a quarterly basis with the leadership team. It doesn't have to be an involved process. If you set your targets ahead of time with the board's knowledge and the leadership team's knowledge, it's really easy to kind of, even as you're running your monthly report, say, oh, whoa, something's not happening. You're constantly in communication with the development fundraising team. And if they tell us that we're going to lose $500,000 of funding, then we can immediately go back to our budget and say, what did we say? What does that mean for our plan? And where do we need to maybe cut? And if that $500,000 of funding is being lost, is there a new funding stream that replaces that? And if not, then let's look at what that does to our programming and our expenses.
You mentioned that there's as much as a year lag between when sort of the private sector experiences something and how that starts to affect donations and things like that. Is the same true for recovery? Does it take a long time, or does that ramp up pretty quickly once those who are in a position to, start giving start to feel like their situation is improving?
The recovery is a bit staggered. It does take a while for some of the bigger foundations where their investments are sort of tied up and they have a longer term planning process of like, well, this year we're giving out this many dollars. If they lose a chunk of their endowment, they won't be able to recover as quickly. So there is that lag on the uptick also. But with individual donors, there tends to be a little more fluidity and spikes. So as they start to recover, they'll start to donate again. And that can happen quicker. So I would say it depends on how much your funding is dependent on foundations and government versus individuals. And that's where you'll see sort of the lag or lack thereof.
What do you think? It's so hard for any of us to think beyond the pandemic because it hit so hard and it's so unique and I think has made a lot of us, in a constant state of awareness or even defensive preparedness. But on the other hand, there is normalcy and there is the normal ebb and flow that is how most of us, I think, in any sector should be ready to sort of conduct our business. How do you see the right posture for that? How do you think we should be thinking as we start to ease into a universe where we are maybe looking beyond the pandemic? What lessons should I have learned? Should I have a pile of cash on hand? Should I be getting into that new sort of project that we hoped for as quickly as we can so that it's behind us? What should I be, aggressive and assertive, or should I be conservative and defensive? Obviously, it depends, but what's the healthy way for me to be thinking about some of these things as I run or am really involved in leadership of my not-for-profit?
I think there's a couple of things. One, it obviously depends on your financial situation where you are right now. Some who were able to squirrel away money and have that a healthy cash reserve, might be able and have the luxury to plan more easily and readily for growth and for the next phase of the organization. Those that maybe struggled a lot during the pandemic and were spending down whatever reserves they had, they're going to be looking to build back those reserves. And in terms of what normalcy looks like, that's still a little TBD. And I think it will depend across the various, because the nonprofit space is so vast, it will depend a lot about, what sector you're in and where your funding is coming from, and where the needs are. I think there's definitely been a push, at least during this pandemic, towards like food safety and security and health and safety, as opposed to some of the other ones where there's an environmental, aspect or conservation that's not happening as much, and it's needed. The government is still like, well, go use your parks. They're like the safe way to like enjoy outdoor space, but where's the funding to sustain those parks? So it really depends on what your recovery path looks like. But I would encourage folks to look at what are some of the lessons learned and some of the new technological changes that have happened in your organization over the last year and a half due to the pandemic, and what can you capitalize on? Maybe board meetings can be part hybrid, part online if they weren't already, like in person or online. Maybe your staff meetings maybe your office space doesn't need to be as big. There's so many questions that you should take a step back and really assess and say, do we need to go back to the same operations? I would encourage everyone, if they haven't done so already, to start taking a step back and saying, who needs to be in the office? Who can work remotely? There was always this push to this like work-life balance and folks working remotely or at least part-time remotely. And what does that look like now? What does that mean for us as we start to come back to the office? Can we take time?
These are great points. And I was going to say, what do you think lessons we can learn from this present reality? And you've pointed out a few that, are true for all of us. I think that we went into a certain reality in 2020 with a status quo that we were so used to and that was so familiar to us that we hadn't second guessed it. We hadn't given it additional thought. And then when we were forced into a state of innovation, even if that meant our innovation is how do we conduct online meetings, for many of us, we've found, look, this is a minimal interruption and so that can change probably the whole dynamic, not just of how we run our organization, but even how we do outreach, how we have donor events, what we can use or create, kind of these strategic plans for spending. All these ideas might be shifted or changed a bit. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, I can't tell you how many virtual galas I attended this past year.
And they worked out, right?
Yeah,
I mean, they worked
really well. They were all different. Some were more interactive than others. Some were pre-recorded. And I understand that it was a pivot and like pretty stressful for the folks who were throwing it because this was new to them. But it ultimately, the expense to dollar raised ratio ended up being better because their expenses ultimately were lower. And then they didn't raise as much. Some did better, but I think a lot has lowered their targets in terms of what they hope to raise. And I'm on a planning committee for a gala for one of the boards I sit on, and we were discussing our upcoming fall, gala, and we thought, well, it should be in person if we can do it, even if it's partially outdoors. It's going to be in the late or early fall, so it should still be good weather here in New York. And let's live stream at least the awards portion of it and the speeches portion of it, where we hadn't done that before. And I came from another organization where we used to always live stream all of our gala events because we had people all over the country who couldn't make it. So using that technology in a different way, like let's make it a hybrid, and see, because that opens up the door to people who may not be able to afford to come. Maybe they give a minimal, whatever they can donation to just live stream the main event, if you will, if they can't make it for whatever reason.
And I think it appreciates and respects the advancement in a lot of sort of technological comfort that has been developed by the average person over the last year, where in the future you might say, maybe our donor base is trends more elderly or something. And so we can make some assumption, fair or not, that maybe they're not so comfortable with live streaming. Well, that's not true anymore. And now we all know how to do it. And I think you're right to say, let's take some of these things that we've learned and now incorporate them into the new going forward, versus sort of, drawing a line and saying, let's just go back to the way we did things. We've got an opportunity here that in this recovery that I think is pretty special.
Yeah, it's funny. I'll tell you a quick story about that. I had a client that was a Y. So they had a ton of community services and programming. And during the pandemic, as you can imagine, they're mostly in person. They have a pool and they had to shut everything down. But they pivoted and they started doing Zumba classes for their retired community on Zoom online. And they were at first sort of apprehensive to move it online because most of their clientele or the people who would attend were in their 70s or 80s. And they're like, they're not going to come on Zoom. I think at one point they hit like 50, 60 people on their Zumba Zoom class. So and they all got online because they wanted to do it, and they were all following along and dancing and exercising. And it was just, it was one of the highlights that we brought to the board, because who would have ever thought that like they were better attended online than in person,
Yes. And the convenience is there. It's the old maxim, necessity is the mother of invention. When people had no alternative, they learned how to do this stuff, and then they realized the comfort of it or the convenience of it, and they're not intimidated by it. And you're right. If we can use those things to our advantage, there's so many new opportunities that I think we can take advantage of. Raji Kalra, thank you so much for spending more time with us today. We've got more I think we can talk about in the future, and I'm looking forward to having you back. Have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks for watching, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Visit ProCFOPartners.com for more strategies and ideas for financial management and growth to help you put your business's financial picture in context.